When we talk about climate change, emissions reduction, or major development in Canada, one aspect that is becoming more and more centered in the discussion is the importance of Indigenous partnership and participation. From the historic deal between Enbridge and 23 First Nations in Alberta to Cedar LNG in BC and other projects across the country, Indigenous communities are changing how we do business in Canada for the better. But there is still work to do. Hey there, you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host Scott Crockett and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate those stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On this episode, we are joined by Karen Ogen, former chief of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation and the current CEO of the First Nations LNG Alliance, the collective of First Nations participating in sustainable and responsible LNG development in BC. And Karen sheds light on the importance of Indigenous ownership in major projects to not only improve the economic well-being of Indigenous communities, but enabling them with the resources to care for the housing, the health, the healing, and other needs of their people. We'll also discuss the importance of energy literacy and the realities of Canada's regulatory systems and the current challenges to enable Indigenous engagement. And Karen also provides advice to other Indigenous communities eager to participate in major projects. If you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show. Well, Karen, it's very lovely to have you on the podcast today. And Scott and I are here in Treaty 7, so the traditional territory of the Blackfoot people and the Stoney Nakoda, as well as the Tsuut'ina. And yeah, we're just very, very grateful to have a conversation with you about regulatory and what we need to do to improve that. But before we dive into our discussion, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
All right. I'll introduce myself in Wet'suwet'en. It's something I learned in the last couple of years. Deneza Tsakoze Skyze. Snakalia to the Stolo Nation for allowing me to reside on their unceded territory. Sai Sozi Karen Ogen. Snit Nekwaon Sophie Ogen. Spit Mitch Ogen Satnian. Sitz Satsan Patty Isaac. To Nekwaon Julie Isaac. Dista Gedimden. What I said in Wet'suwet'en is male chiefs, female chiefs, children of chiefs. Thank you to the Stolo Nation for allowing me to reside on their unceded territory. My name is Karen Ogen. My mother's name is Nekwaon Sophie Ogen. My father, Mitch Ogen Satnian, which means he's passed away quite a few years ago. Tits is my grandfather, Satsan Patty Isaac. Grandmother, Nekwaon Julie Isaac, and my clan is Gedimden. So thank you for allowing me to be on this podcast.
Thank you, Karen. That's absolutely wonderful.
So your role right now is the CEO of First Nations LNG Alliance. Can you tell us a little bit about that role, what the Alliance stands for, and how you came to this job?
We came up with this idea in 2015 during my tenure as the chief of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. And it was in light of the controversy that was happening within the Wet'suwet'en territories over the LNG pipeline. And why the First Nations LNG Alliance was formed, one was to provide education and awareness. Because as soon as any of our Indigenous people in the North had heard the word pipeline, they automatically assumed it was oil. And they were going to oppose any pipeline. So we wanted to make sure that we gave information awareness so that people could make an informed decision whether they support LNG. And so that was the premise of why we started the Alliance, and then give voice to those nations that supported LNG, because we were getting a huge backlash on social media. And we wanted to try to come from a place of, let's learn about this and let's see if we support it or not. So be informed and do your due diligence, do your homework, find out what LNG is about. So that was why the First Nations LNG Alliance was formed back in 2015.
So you mentioned that you served as chief of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation for about 6 years. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience and what that meant to you and what you learned from it that's contributed to the person on this call today?
Well, prior to that, I was a social worker for a good 25 years doing frontline work, managerial, administrative, being a director of an organization. And I decided to take a year off, or at least that's what I thought. I moved back to my home community of Burns Lake, which I thought I'd never do. I swore up and down I wasn't going to move home, but I did. And my year off wasn't working out well. I was going to the office. I said, give me something to do. I'll volunteer. So they gave me a stack of envelopes, and as I'm sitting there looking, I'm like, what the heck did I do? I sold my house, moved like licking envelopes here in my home community. So I didn't realize that it was our election was looming, and my mom, who's a hereditary chief and well respected, she just asked me, because my sister before that would ask me over and over and over, and I'd say no, I'm not running for chief. But my mom, you don't say no to my mom. So she said, Karen, you should run for chief. And I just looked at her. I wanted to say no, but she just looked at me. And mom's never ever told me what to do in my life. Well, maybe as a child, but not as an adult. So I said yes. I'll put my name forward just for you, Mom. Not like I really want to, but I'll do it. And election came, and I got in by one vote.
Amazing.
Wow.
So it's a small community. And so I just thought, well, I guess I better, do my job. And so my passion has always been to work for our people, whether it be in social work or what have you. So, I'll try my, I sat on council before, didn't care for it. So I thought, well, I better make a difference. I have a 3-year term. I better make a difference. And so we had so many atrocities happening in our community, fires, floods, and then that mill explosion. And, I thought we need just something good to happen for our community. So we built a hall and health center that our elders really wanted. And just to see the joy on their faces, I still see the images of their faces, that they're gone now, but they wanted a hall. And we did our first totem pole carving and raising ceremony in our community. It was just so good to see the joy and the happiness on our elders' faces, to see that we have a hall. We've been asking for a hall, and we have one. So I got elected into my second term, and we built an administration building. But little did I know that advocating for our people and wanting what's best for our people would really kind of, it's like pressing grapes, like the pressure was on. What are you made of? Just the pressure was on, and we were in the midst of negotiating our pipeline agreement with Coastal GasLink, and we said yes because there was benefits to our community that we would never had before. Like our small community, we were given swampland, and we couldn't build any houses there. And my mom was the chief at the time, and she purchased land from a farmer and had to designate it into reserve land so that we could build more homes. Our community is small. We've had forestry, which is on a downturn now. But, we've had major projects go through our community without us at the table. Those major projects were railways, highways, transmission lines, pipelines, and we never had a say and a share in any of that. And so this time we're actually being asked, we have a seat at the table. We don't know nothing about pipelines. This is something brand new to all of us. And, so we looked at the benefits, the legacy benefits that we'd be getting once the pipe is in the ground. We looked at the employment and training possibilities for our people to get them to careers and red seal so that they'd have a job long beyond the pipeline once the construction is complete. And just looking at how, it'll help our community. We've had poor drinking water in our community. It wasn't drinkable. We had to get bottles of water brought into our community, and we had like a lack of housing, like you name it, the social economic issues of our community. It's something that every leader gets inherited, is the social economic issues of your community. And so, to have these LNG projects come to our community, it was pluses all the way around. But at the same time too, we want to look after our people, but also take care of the land. So that's our balance that we had to. That was our job, was to make sure that we're taking care of the people in the land. little did we know that this would be so controversial for us. I said in our week in Ottawa that I was in the eye of the storm. And one of the fellows on our delegation had asked me, what did you mean by that? And I said, when we signed our agreement, we signed a provincial agreement here in BC with another nation. And we had our hereditary chiefs from our community back us. But boy, oh boy, when it hit social media, we were just blasted. And some of it by our own people, by our own flesh and blood. And that was really hard to take because we really believed what we were doing was good for the people.
Mhm.
And so I was down south and one of my council members called me and she was crying. She says, Karen, I don't know if we did the right thing. I don't know. Like she says, our people are going to the town of Burns Lake. They're getting called names. They're being put down, even our elders. That hit my heart. That really hit my heart. I just thought, oh, like for a minute there, I doubted myself. And that just saddened me. So I went to sleep that night and I thought, well, I just said a prayer in my heart. I just said, God, I don't know. You need to let me know if we did the right thing. Because I was just so downcast. It was just like one of your children have been hurt and you feel it. So the next morning I woke up and without a doubt in my mind, I thought this was for the people. This is for the people. Now we can say that we have good drinking water. We have more houses in our community that this current council has put in. And these are the benefits that are coming from a portion of it is coming from the pipeline, which we've never had before. So I count those small winnings as big wins for our community because they're meaningful. We have families that have roofs over their heads and they have clean drinking water. So I think I think those are huge for our community and no one can take that away from us. And I've never I've seen and heard of backlash on me, but I just thought, nope, I'm gonna ignore them. This is about the people. It's not about me, it's about our people.
Well, that's a fantastic story, Karen, and fantastic results. And the only thing I'd say is that to me, I don't think those are small wins as you describe them. I think those are a number of really big wins, actually, and I think indicative of what's possible and probably showing the way for what some other communities and businesses are doing in terms of partnership now. You mentioned that we were recently part of a delegation together, and it was my extreme honor. We were a group of about 9 folks who went to Ottawa to talk about major projects, to talk about regulatory, to talk about LNG, and parts of the story that you just shared, I had heard bits from you before. And one that I wanted to ask you about in particular is you talked about the crushing grapes, the pressure that you were sometimes under, or maybe pressure from multiple angles. How did you make your decisions? What would you sort of say to yourself when you were faced with pressure from many perspectives about what your role was, what your job was, who you were serving?
Well, number one, during my tenure as chief, the people who voted you in are the people that are the priority in anything what you say and do. And I'd say this at the tables that I was at meetings. I said, you got to ask yourself who benefits and why. And this was something that a PhD had taught me in social work, and I've carried that with me into my roles of leadership. The work that I'm doing, who benefits and why, and so that was something that I'd always gauge myself, like what am I doing? Is it benefiting me or the people? And we would have monthly community member meetings. And we'd be updating them because we were moving fast. We had a lot of things going on, and so we had to keep them updated, and to make sure we are doing our due diligence by informing our members, letting them know where we are, because I was gone 2-3 weeks out of the month, and so they'd like to know where's our leader, and so I have to give an account. This is where I am. This is what I'm doing. This is on your behalf. And so we had to keep them updated so that they whatever they'd hear on social media, they'd be able to say, no, she came to us and this is what she's been doing in wherever. So accountability and transparency was huge, like letting our people know so that I had their support and their backing, our elders, our chiefs in our community. I made sure that we did our due diligence and they had my back, because then that didn't matter what anybody else said,
Mhm.
because I had the backing of our elders and our people, and they seen they were reaping the benefits. We had a brand new hall, we had a brand new administration building, we had our own business arm, we were developing our natural resources. So there was lots of wins for our community.
Mm.
And so with that, when it was all over social media and on the news about the Wet'suwet'en and the hereditary chiefs, and it became about hereditary chiefs versus elected chiefs. And that's not where I want it to be,
Mhm.
because it's like, I've heard the saying before, a house divided against itself will fall. So as long as our people are divided, it's going to be really hard for us to move forward. So that was always like a piece of me that was saying, we need to have peace. We need to make peace. I don't know if that's going to happen during my lifetime, but I want to see our whole Wet'suwet'en nation move forward. And without that, we need to come together and make peace. We need to find a resolution that's going to appease everybody. Because after doing my MBA, I wrote a paper on our nation. And again, it's about the people and the land. And, if you had to really, really pick and choose from one of them, which would you choose? Which would you put as a priority? And that's a question I had to ask myself.
A difficult question.
For me, people will say, well, if you take care of the land will take care of you. Well, from my perspective, we got to take care of the people so the people can take care of the land.
Mhm.
We're living beings, like, so is the earth. But like, I think if there was a priority, I would say that we come first.
Mhm.
And we need to take care of one another so we can take care of the land. So that's my perspective. And I feel like, I've never wanted to be at odds with our own people, but for me, it was about fighting for our community, getting what's best, increase the quality of life for our people. Then I can say, I can wake up the next day and say, I'm doing my job.
If you've made life a little bit better for your people, yeah, then you
Yeah.
have been doing your job. Well, and as you said, you and I were just recently in Ottawa, and I heard, as you told parts of this story or versions of the story to many of the most senior ministers in Canada, in the office of the Prime Minister, and I watched people, just struck by this story that you've told about how your key focus was on making life better for people, and how previous to these projects, life was very different. The things you've mentioned about a lack of clean water and a lack of housing and how it's tangibly different now. I think that really, really struck people. I watched it really strike people, because so many of these discussions about big projects like LNG can be very abstract when we talk about them for the whole country. But when you talked about it, you really brought it down to your own community and your specific people and the specific results that they'd sort of felt from it. And I think that is something often missing from our overall discussion. And maybe, well, to jump off of that, I'll ask you what else is missing from our discussion on LNG and big projects. Recently you wrote an op-ed in Business in Vancouver, sort of pushing back against some of the misinformation about LNG and suggesting that, we need more LNG literacy maybe in Canada. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What do you think people need to know?
Well, I think that they need to know, like, Canada is rich in the natural resources. Like, after all of my travels to different countries, Canada is a good country to live in. From my perspective, if the natural resources were shared with the Indigenous people, there would be no poverty.
I tend to agree.
I think that we're rich in our natural resources. A lot of countries come to us for our wood, for our oil, and for our gas. We should be standing on our own 2 feet and selling it, and bringing money back to our economy, instead of selling it to the States and they turn around and make double, and we're sitting back and our economy, we're in a recession almost. And so it just makes sense for us to be able to sell our resources. We are in such a geographical area where it's an advantage to us, where we can sell to Asia and to Europe and to other countries that are in need. I think that from our community's perspective, those projects are very meaningful, because if forestry is on a downturn, then what else do we have? We may have mining, but it's up and coming, but I don't think that these major projects, I don't think people know enough on what these projects mean to northern, remote and rural communities in northern BC. I think that, we're going to have a share and a say, like not only that, the equity ownership. You hear a lot of conversations from different perspectives on what economic reconciliation is.
Right.
From my
What it
perspective,
means.
yeah. So from my perspective, coming from a community that we grew up in poverty, and to finally have some things, that luxuries that other Canadians have had for many years, we're finally going to be getting some revenues to our community. And we operated in a poverty mindset before, and now it's like we got to switch that thinking, that mindset, to think like, how are we going to manage wealth?
Mm-hmm.
We got to do, play our cards right and be able to manage our wealth and think about our people 7 generations down the road.
Right.
So I think these projects are very meaningful to us in various ways that I think a lot of Canadians don't know. Some people think that pipelines are just like brand new, that they've never existed before. They don't know that since the 1950s, pipelines have been put in across this country without no consultation or accommodation to First Nations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are the messages that we want to get out, is that the people that have zero knowledge on pipelines, zero knowledge on LNG, catch them up to speed and say, this is what we're doing with these projects. We're going to have a piece of equity ownership into these projects. That means revenues are going to come back to our communities, so we can have more housing, we can have better roads, we can have more infrastructure in our communities. So the benefits are far outweigh the negative. And I think that we're on a good path to economic reconciliation, because if economic reconciliation means to me is that our people are advancing. The quality of our life for our people is getting better. The health, education, your social status, everything about our lives will increase. So I think, how can you beat that? What else do you have?
Mm-hmm.
That's such an encouraging note, Karen, that you shared there, the quality of life for people getting better. And, as you mentioned, I think you said, there were pipelines, or a pipeline put across the Wet'suwet'en territory before, but without consultation, without any benefits necessarily flowing back because of the time that was done. I'm wondering if you should share, for the benefit of, some of the folks in the audience who might belong to other nations that haven't done deals like this, or project proponents who are thinking of arrangements with First Nations, or even the federal government folks who deal with the policy. What can we learn from your experience in the Wet'suwet'en and the other nations that the Alliance deals with for other types of large major projects that involve First Nations?
First off, I think that especially from government's perspective, making sure that the nations are unified, because when all was said and done with the Wet'suwet'en, it became about the hereditary chiefs and the elected chiefs. It's just like we're a bird. We're they're each wing, but we belong to the same bird. We're still one people. And I think that when both the federal and provincial government met with our people regarding the MOU, they should have met with everybody. Mm-hmm. And they left out the elected councils. And people say that, oh, well, that's a colonial construct. It's something that was imposed upon us. Yes, that's true. But until we have another form of governance, that's what we have to work with. And it's an oppressive piece of legislation, but that's the only thing we have to work with in today, unless you choose another form of governance. But our issue is advancing our people today, not 10, 20 years from now, today. So we have to work within that system, and the hereditary chiefs of the day need to work with the elected councils so that we can move our people forward. And I think that we're in light of climate change right now. And I took the sustainability course, and I have to mention this, that, I've learned that there's 9 planetary boundaries. Climate change is one of them. And what they're wanting to propose is that we move our Earth's temperature to 1 degree. And when I learned that we haven't been at 1 degree since 12,000 years ago. So you need to think about it. Like, think about this. Like, what were we doing 12,000 years ago? We weren't extracting any oil and gas. There was no extractions. We were probably pounding rock somewhere. But you got to think about that. We cannot go back to 12,000 years ago. It sounds ideal, but we need to be realistic on how we move forward today. Can we go backwards? Are we going to try to, shove all the extractions back in the ground and leave it there? Like, I think we need to have a realistic plan on how we're going to move forward with LNG and how it's the cleanest fossil fuel that we're, wanting to sell to other countries, which will get these other countries off of coal, which is a higher emitter. That's the question for leadership. What is the right thing to do? Not because it's popular, but what is the right thing to do?
So you mentioned climate change, and I just want to pull on that thread for a minute. So you were part of this delegation to Ottawa to talk about just the importance of improving our regulatory systems so that we can get major projects built and that, communities can experience those benefits. But right now, if we ever want to meet our 2030, 2050 emissions reduction goals, we have to build a lot of stuff. But right now, the regulatory systems just they're not enabling us to build the stuff. So from your perspective, as CEO of the First Nations LNG Alliance, what do you see as some of those challenges within the regulatory system that are maybe impeding Indigenous engagement or opportunity to build major projects?
Well, before I go on to the challenges, I need to say this before I forget. The delegation to Ottawa with the Alberta Business Council was probably the best delegation that I've been on.
Oh, thank you.
That's very kind.
I come away from that well organized. The feedback on the paper was everything was a plus all the way across. Like it was an A+. It was timely from what I heard from, stemming from the budget 2023. It's on their radar. Every office that we met with, it's on their radar because it's like everybody sees the writing on the wall. The regulatory system is impeding Canada from moving forward. It's taking projects, 7 to 10 years to get built here in Canada. And the rest of the countries are bypassing us, and we're sitting here thinking, well, we're going into a recession. I'm not an expert in anything, but I think that, Canada needs money. How do we get money? We have resources to sell, then let's get it to market. How can we do that? Well, Canada needs to put their heads together and fast track the regulatory system, but at the same time, to making sure that we're hitting those targets and making sure we're taking care of our environment. I think that's the overall concern, is making sure that we're doing things right and that, we're not trying to slow projects down, but making sure we take care of the environment. That's number one. And then making sure we're taking care of the people when it comes to our resources, like the Canadians and Indigenous people. Indigenous people should be at the forefront. So I think that with these major projects, I think that that's the way to go, is making sure that this regulatory system, looking at why it's so slow, how can we speed it up so that Canada can benefit? That should be our overall goal.
Well, I think that's so well said, Karen, and thank you for those kudos. That paper, we just launched it now, called Future Unbuilt, and I think you've summed up what it's all about perfectly, which is how can we get things built faster, but at the same time without sacrificing any environmental protection or human protection or other safety. That's the goal, and as a country like Canada, clearly we have to be able to do that.
So one of the ideas that we had in there was some financial supports for Indigenous communities to invest in these large projects. I wanted to ask something very similar, like a national version of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation Loan Guarantee Program. I'm curious, what do you think something like that, like what kind of impact do you think that would have?
I think it's a plus. Like I just, learned about this stuff on the delegation. And I think that to do it nationally, I think it's good, but I think we kind of get lost in the shuffle. Because when you think about First Nations, there's 600 across Canada, 200 are in BC. It's like wanting to move these nations forward. So like I come away from this delegation thinking, well, you know what? We have the First Nations Major Projects Coalition that's doing some really groundbreaking work. on
Yeah.
behalf of our people, getting those loan guarantees. And I've read in the news about how they've met with Ottawa and they want to, get these loan guarantees for Indigenous people. I think that, I look at the Alberta model, how Enbridge got the 23 First Nations together. That's a feat in itself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think about us here in BC, where Coastal GasLink had, I think, 10% of 75% equity ownership, but we first had 11 out of the 20 come to the table, and then another faction came together. So to bring 20 nations plus to the table is a feat in itself. It's like herding cats, because everybody's got different agendas, different political ideas. And so I say that was a huge win, a huge plus for the Alberta nations. And I would like to see BC and all of the rest of the province replicate that, because if it means benefits back to our communities, benefits back to these nations, then let's do what works.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at these models and take what we need from it and use it for our own provinces, so that we can say across Canada, these are all the nations and these are the equity ownership that each of these nations have in these major projects. I think that's a huge win.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you gave a little bit of a shout out to the First Nations Major Project Coalition there as well, because it's my impression that they're doing fantastic work in this area and pushing for some of those things like financial tools for First Nations to use as well.
As we wrap up, Karen, I've been quite quiet over here. I've just been listening very intently to your story and some of the wisdom that you're sharing. And I'm going to walk away from this podcast with lots to think about. But as we wrap up, I want to turn the floor over to you for any final idea or insight, or just final thought that you want to leave people with.
I think that we're in a time and an era where, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is coming to life. Even though it was a report that seemed like it was going to be shelved, I think that the findings of the 215 children plus a couple of years ago in May, I think that those make it real for Indigenous people. That in itself makes it real, that what happened to our people, these schools were meant to be for education, not a burial ground. So for me, the education of residential schools and how real it was for our people, the impacts to our people, we need to get on this healing path. And how do we get there? We have generations of unresolved trauma within our communities, and that's what leadership is faced with. So, in order to get healing, that takes money. It takes people that's, skilled people to bring us to that place of healing. So when you think about Indigenous leadership, especially over communities, you have a lot to work with. They're inundated with a lot of issues, not just major projects, but social, economic, health, housing, natural resources. They're inundated with all of these issues. But I think when you stop and you look at the bigger picture of what it is to be an Indigenous leader, it's again, those basic premises, the people and the land. If you can make those the main targets for helping our people and taking care of the land, then I think that, we're able to move those nations forward. And I think, working with the governments of the day, I think that's really important, and how these major projects are really impacting our people and what it means to our people that are healing on the ground. That means there's more resources for us to get trauma counseling. So those are the things that we need to look at, like looking at the big picture, but looking at what it means to these small communities. How are we impacting them? If there's, healing happening, better water, better housing, better education, higher levels of education, then we can say, yes, these projects are meaningful, they're beneficial, and we've done our job. I think that's, every leader should be asking themselves, who benefits and why?
That's a beautiful sentiment to leave this podcast on. Well, hand to heart to you, Karen, for this conversation and sharing this space with us. We're very grateful for the time that you've given to us.
Yes, thank you very much, Karen. I look forward to the next opportunity for us to do something together.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity, and kudos to Alberta Business Council. You guys did a really good job.
And
Me
same
too.
to the First Nations LNG Alliance. We're thrilled to be able to partner with you at every possible opportunity.
Messiah.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.